In my last video, I talked about some archaeological critiques of the Bible and how messy they can be. The four worst all being examples from the Bronze Age. There's a reason for that. The fact is that it gets harder to attack the Bible once we arrive at around the middle 700s BC, because we start having other accounts at that point that corroborate the biblical narrative. The first event that does this in specific detail concerns the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem and a man called Rabshakeh, the man who stood before the walls of Jerusalem and pronounced its doom.
The palace walls of Nineveh displayed this gruesome catalogue of brutality. The flayings, the impalings, the deportations. What kind of civilization chooses this as its wallpaper?
The Assyrians. The answer to that question is the Assyrians. What you saw there is what adorned their walls of their palace in Nineveh. Now, I have this "do you really understand history" litmus test question. It goes like this. Persia, Babylon, and Assyria all overlap ethnically and geographically. The first two even chronologically. So what's the difference? What makes them distinct? Your basic names and places not really understanding anything historian doesn't know the answer here. A historian who gets it will say religion, or more specifically, they had different belief systems. Assyria was Assyria and not Persia or Babylon because its belief system was distinct from Persia and Babylonian belief systems. The Assyrians rose to power at the end of a period historians call the Bronze Age collapse. We don't know too much about this period, but kingdoms all around the Mediterranean went into decline or even just disappeared during this time, and the best guess as to why is that a massive upheaval, like a series of big volcanic eruptions, destroyed crops and sent peoples from the north and the west fleeing down into the Mediterranean, where they fought with the empires and the city-states already there. This kind of flood of devastation basically rolled through the Middle East until it stopped right at Assyria's door, meaning that Assyria was left intact and suddenly able to fill the power vacuum all around it. Assyria probably never would have risen to power any other way. You see, the Assyrian religion, their belief system, was certainly pagan, but it wasn't just pagan. It was a little backwards for this period in that it still had threads of something called pantheism running through it. Now, if you're a pantheist, you're not drawing a real clear distinction between the physical and the metaphysical realms. Think of your primitive tribal societies. You got spirits for rocks and trees and everything else. Beliefs like this have some strange effects on the way that people perceive their world. For instance, torture is a basic facet of pantheist societies. Our later fully pagan societies are not nearly as big on it. They weren't skinning their victims alive after every victory. It was too much work. But for a pantheist, the things you do to a body in this world directly affect it metaphysically. And this is why we find our tribal societies spending enormous amounts of time and energy inflicting all sorts of mutilations on their victims. The one example I'll give here is the difference in the way the two kings of Judah were carried off into captivity in the Bible. When Judah was conquered later by the Babylonians, the chronicle account says that the king was bound with bronze shackles, so he was carried off in chains. Before that, when King Manasseh of Judah was carried off by the Assyrians, it says they put a hook in his nose. In fact, the Assyrian accounts, because they love to write about this stuff, says that they hooked the prisoner by his nose and lips, so anytime his pace slowed behind the chariot in front of him, those hooks would rip into his skin. This picture has been softened for its audience. Pulling someone like this would have been a very bloody mode of travel. I talked about this effect in my first Debating Worldview video, of what happens when you have a society like the Assyrian, and because things like torture are commonplace there, their society tends to become simply numb to the grotesque violence in a way that the peoples around them were not. For us now, the sorts of things that the Assyrians did to their enemies, the hooks, the skinnings, the mutilations, are the sorts of things we put into our horror movies. And make no mistake, the nations around them were just utterly terrified of them. You see, the Assyrians were really good at one thing: warfare. They had the largest army in the world at the time and were the first nation to perfect siege engines. The result being that no one around them could feel safe. Didn't matter if you had thick protective walls. Up until this time, walls were almost a king's X. You were safe inside them. Not anymore. Nothing stopped the Assyrians. If they wanted you dead, you were going to die, and you were going to die badly. Now, the Bible says that the Judean king Hezekiah was one of their good kings. In the early 700s BC, he instituted a wave of reforms, ridding Judah of pagan worship and putting it back on the path to monotheism. Prior to this, Judah had been a vassal state of Assyria, just like every other state in the area. But Hezekiah revolted, and the biblical account certainly implies that this was a part of the reforms, no longer sending annual tribute to a nation that the Bible says in the minor prophet Nahum, chapter 1, I have dug your grave, for you are vile. Assyria had some internal issues at the time, and Hezekiah might have been hoping that little Judah would be small enough to be ignored. It wasn't. The Assyrian king Sennacherib rolled out the army en masse and attacked. Both the Assyrian account of this and the archaeology make it clear that he started wiping little Judah off the map. At the time the Assyrian delegation arrived at Jerusalem, the main body of the Assyrian army was King Sennacherib was south, surrounding the Judeans holding out inside the walled city of Lachish. Lachish was one of the Judean cities that resisted. But the Assyrians did not take kindly to resistance. When they were done, they destroyed Lachish so completely that it was never rebuilt. This is it now. You're looking at it. In fact, the siege mound Sennacherib's army built up to its walls is still there to this day. You can go there and see right where they rolled up their battering rams, right where they punched through Lachish's walls and killed or enslaved every single one of its inhabitants. People in Jerusalem must have been almost hysterical. The biblical account tells us the preparations that Jerusalem made for the siege, including digging straight into rock to make it to water. Archaeologists found the shaft and inscriptions that described how it was cut. It wasn't easy. Mining was hard in 700 BC. And I show the scene I'm about to show to give you a little taste of what it must have felt like when the first contingent of Assyrian war machines arrived at Jerusalem's gates. This is not the only time Jerusalem came under siege. I'll do a video on the Roman siege of Jerusalem under Titus at some point. But make no mistake, this would have been a very different thing. The Jews could have negotiated with the Romans. They didn't, but they could have. In 70 AD, with the Romans, they had the choice between atrocity or no. When the Assyrians arrived, the only choice they had was between unbelievable atrocity or surrender and then slightly less atrocity. I repeat, this was the capital of a tiny nation faced with the largest army the world had ever seen at that time. An army that spent time torturing you after they took your city. For the Jews cowering behind those walls at the time, it would have felt something like they were facing this. Before the attack, the Bible tells us that 3 Assyrian officials separated from the Assyrian lines and approached the walls. One of these was the supreme commander of the Assyrian military, the Tartan. One was the chief of eunuchs, the Rabshakeh, who would have traveled with the Assyrian king at the time, Sennacherib, whenever he was moving with a large entourage. And finally, the last, the Rabshakeh. If you have an NIV translation, it calls him the field commander, which is a little hackneyed. Rabshakeh was the royal cupbearer, the king's advisor. And just what was this guy doing there at that moment? We find out very quickly, because Rabshakeh began addressing the Hebrews in Hebrew, no interpreter. The Hebrews were startled by this. They sent out a delegation to meet Rabshakeh and ask him to stop. And that's when Rabshakeh revealed himself. He started yelling up to the walls, not just in Hebrew, which few people at the time outside of Judah spoke, but those words that were softening down to dung and piss were yelled out as Hebrew profanities. This wasn't just the high language of an interpreter, of some court official. This was gutter language, the language of a native Hebrew. And the ancient Hebrew Talmud tells us that's exactly who Rabshakeh was. It calls him a Hebrew traitor. So what's going on here? What is a Hebrew doing in the court of the Assyrian king? Christian historians say that he probably came from one of the nearby Semitic-speaking regions like Moab. But I think they're hedging. After all, wouldn't it be just a little too convenient to have yet another Hebrew cupbearer to a Mesopotamian king? That's what Nehemiah was. Not only that, that's basically what the prophet Daniel was to multiple emperors. Joseph here with Pharaoh in Egypt, he was too. In fact, the Judean king that I mentioned earlier, the one carried off in bronze shackles, the Bible says that eventually he became a sort of special advisor in Babylon. At what point do we consider that they were just embellishing their stories? Yeah, but there's just one little pushback for that. You see, the same thing happens outside the Bible, just as much as it happens in it. Think about it. All sorts of fellows in the Herodian line became special friends/advisors to Roman emperors. Heck, the reason we know so much about Judea in the first century is because a guy named Flavius Josephus, a captured Jew, suddenly became an advisor first to Emperor Vespasian and then to Vespasian's son Titus. And you can play this game pretty much up until modern times. Have a little accident that places a Jew in English Anglican circles, and suddenly you get Benjamin Disraeli, probably the most famous of all British prime ministers. So what's happening with the Rabshakeh? And where did he come from? Simple. Assyria had just conquered and deported Israel, 10 out of the 12 Hebrew tribes. Rabshakeh was almost certainly a Hebrew taken as a court servant from those tribes, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for Babylon. And just like those guys in Daniel, and all the other examples we could give, he rose to prominence. Because of course he did. There's nothing magical happening here. Hebrew thinking is tempered by Mosaic law, a set of rules meant to reinforce belief in an all-powerful God, and so belief in what we would now call objective truth, reality outside of our control. And when you realize that in the pagan world, the advisors would have been giving advice based on the idea of a reality that's in mankind's control, so forms of divination like astrology, and the Assyrian advisors would have just been a mess of pagan divination and pantheist mysticism, then it's obvious that someone who thinks in a rational, objective way would stand out against that kind of competition. Remember, no one thinks like the ancient Assyrians anymore, not in the modern developed world. People who think like the Jews? Yep, they're still here. So Rabshakeh, who was raised in a society that had a belief system fundamentally compatible with the modern world, well, in a society like Assyria, which did not, he stood out. He rose to prominence, and he used what he knew against his own people. Let's go back to that scene in front of Jerusalem's walls. We know from those Assyrian wall reliefs, one of which has someone leaning out of a siege tower reading from a scroll, that this kind of thing was common. Psychological warfare. Tell them what's about to happen to them. Mess with their heads. The first lines Rabshakeh quotes were probably straight off that scroll, since later on we have a letter sent which gives the same list of destroyed cities in the same order. But once he starts yelling at the walls, he goes off script for a minute. And what does he say? Every Christian study I looked at compared the first bit here about high places belonging to your God to his later words saying, and besides, the Lord sent me here to destroy you, as a contradiction, and conclude he didn't know what he was saying. Oh, I bet they're wrong. I remember watching a video of a guy asking a Christian apologist something like this: how come you believe in God, but you don't believe in Zeus and you don't believe in Allah? This guy didn't realize the word for Allah is Arabic for God. Zeus is one of the 3 Greek words that means God: Zeus, Deus, and Theos. So, all in English, he literally asked, why do you believe in God? But you don't believe in God and you don't believe in God. In fact, one of the most common names used for God in the Old Testament was Baal prior to translation, which was just Aramaic for Lord and is the equivalent to the Hebrew word Adonai. So biblical writers living during Babylonian exile used that term. We took it out in later translations to clear up the confusion. Unfortunately, in doing so, we created another bit of confusion, that this was an argument between one God and another. No, not exactly. To be precise, the argument was, how do we conceive of God? Is God small and limited, like the Canaanite conception of their Lord, their Baal? Or is God all-powerful and all-knowing, like the Hebrew concept? So Rabshakeh raised doubt in their minds. Did God want you to tear down those high places? Are you sure? When King Hezekiah collapsed after Rabshakeh's challenge, that's why. It was an existential challenge to his core beliefs, and it shook him. And then we get the answer. And the answer explains what it means to be all-powerful. It means that the big army is only the big army because the all-powerful God brought all of the events and circumstances into being for them to become the big army. This whole passage is addressed as a direct reply to Rabshakeh. And it doesn't say it, but I've got to think that someone shouted this message back over the walls at him. And what happened next? Later ancient sources called it an outbreak of disease, but writers like Josephus might have just been softening down the spooky elements for his Roman audience. There's no reason to think Josephus had any inside knowledge here, and the Romans really weren't big on spooky. For its part, the Hebrew tradition is that it happened on the first night of Passover, a kind of mirror image of the plague of the firstborn in Egypt. However it took place, the death of a massive portion of the Assyrian army left quite an impression. All you need to know is right here on this map. The green and purple is Assyria, basically every civilized area in the region at the time. And the tiny little speck of brown in the bottom left that you may or may not be able to see is the one region in the Near East that Assyria could not conquer. It's Judah. Judah did what no one, not even much larger, much more powerful nations could do at the time. Little tiny Judah survived the Assyrian onslaught. And during King Hezekiah's life, Assyria never came back, in spite of the fact that they were still in conflict with Egypt, and this meant any campaign in Egypt would be done with a possible adversary at its back, which is why Sennacherib was worried about Judah and sent that letter in 2 Kings chapter 19. Didn't matter. They treated it like the forbidden zone. We don't go in there. We never go in there. Now, this only held until King Hezekiah's death. Under his son Manasseh, Judah once again appears on the roll of Assyrian's vassal states. Don't know why. Did the Assyrians attribute the die-off to King Hezekiah specifically? Manasseh leaned pagan until the end of his life. He might have actually initiated relations. Don't know. However it played out, we never hear another word from our Hebrew trader Rabshakeh, and it's certainly tempting to assume that he was amongst the dead.
To make a long story short, today not a single mainstream biblical scholar or archaeologist any longer upholds biblical archaeology's conquest model. Not one.
No? Not a single one? Even if that were true, why would that sort of survey be relevant to archaeological study? I don't know. I just thought archaeology would be less preachy. It's almost like Professor Deaver there wasn't always an archaeologist. Like maybe he was once, oh look, he used to be a Baptist preacher. Think that's unusual? No, it's not. Michael Shermer went to Christian College Pepperdine to study theology. Richard Dawkins was a Christian until his teen years. Bart Ehrman trained to be a Christian apologist. Now he basically uses what he learned from Bruce Metzger to sow doubt in religious Christians' minds. Modern-day Rabshakehs. They learned to think, they learned to reason, they learned to persuade. Well, let's just call it what it is. They learned to evangelize. And I think this trend grows going forward. The people learning modern humanist race and gender theories, by and large, don't even care, and their thinking is going to be so muddled that deconverted Christians and Jews will easily rise to prominence in this setting. You know, in the land of the blind. I might do a reaction video to some of this stuff at some point, but my overriding point would be exactly what happened at Jerusalem all those centuries ago. Rabshakeh looked at his homeland and probably thought that it was outmoded and insignificant. He didn't realize that in the grand scheme, Assyria was insignificant. Same thing now. The Bill Deavers and the Bart Ehrmans of the world look at biblical scriptures like a figment of the past. They're totally oblivious to the storm gathering all around. A storm predicted by those very scriptures. Maybe we should look at those next. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Click like and subscribe and click the notification bell and we'll try and keep the videos coming. Also, see the link below to order Book 1 of the Holocaust Engine series, our pandemic post-apocalyptic horror that won the Pinnacle Award for the best science fiction novel of 2020.